Hello, everyone. My name is Juno Shweri. I'm the film programs curator at ArteEast, and I'm very excited to welcome you here to Arab Modernism as World Cinema, Moumen Smihi and Peter Limbrick in conversation with Tarek Elhaik. This event is part of Radical Modernisms, Retracing Arab and North African Film Histories, a two-part program curated by Peter Limbrick. The films in part one feature the works of Moumen Smihi and Mohammed Malas, and will be screening until October 17th. Also, please make sure to check out part two of the program, which will be available from October 21st to 24th. And you can learn more about each program and reserve your tickets at artearchive.org. This program is co-sponsored by the Center for the Middle East and North Africa at UC Santa Cruz and is part of ArteEast, Unpacking the Arte Archive Legacy Program, which highlights ArteEast film and video collection, presenting curators' selections from the Arte Archive and dialogue with contemporary voices. We encourage the audience to drop any questions or comments in chat, and there will be time allocated after the discussion to answer your questions. I would like to introduce our panelists today. Peter Limbrick is professor of film and media and digital media at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He is the author of Arab Modernism as World Cinema, the films of Moumen Smihi. In addition, he has published articles on Arab cinema, post-colonial and international film and video, and queer theory. He has also curated several film and video programs, including a traveling retrospective of the works of Moroccan filmmaker Moumen Smihi. We also have Moumen Smihi himself, born in 1945 in Tangier, Morocco. Moumen attended film school in Paris, where he was deeply influenced by the revolutionary ideas of 1968 Paris, and driven by a desire to interweave this social and political consciousness with his experience of the Maghreb. Smihi's groundbreaking work, pursued over a long and prolific career, includes documentaries, shorts, and feature-length work made in Morocco, Egypt, and France, as well as 5 volumes of writings comprising critical interviews, articles on Arab, European, and Hollywood cinema, and essays on film theory. Our moderator, Tarek Elhaik. Tarek is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of California, Davis, and a film curator. He is the author of The Incurable Image, Curating Post-Mexican Film and Media Arts, and Aesthetics and Anthropology Cogitations. He has also curated several programs and symposia on avant-garde cinema from Latin America and the Arab world. He directed AIL, the Anthropology of the Image Lab, a space for conversation with interlocutors in adjacent disciplines, committed to fostering inquiries through the creation of images and concepts. So I will pass it over now to Peter, who will tell us more about the program. Welcome, everyone.
First of all, extend my thanks to Jinu and to Beth Stryker, Director of ArteEast, for their tireless work in setting up these two programs. We're sometimes, I think, now inclined to think of online events as all of us just kind of jumping online as if we're freed from all the demands of space and architecture and materials, but really that's not the case. And there's a lot of behind-the-scenes labor that goes into something seemingly simple. So thanks also to our technical guru, Jordan Lee Thompson, for all of his work putting this together. When I began to think about this two-part program through the theme of unpacking the Arte Archive, I was struck by two things. The depth and breadth of ArteEast's programming, which has been simply extraordinary over a period now of almost 20 years. I have benefited hugely from that, introducing generations of students now to some of the films that ArteEast made available in its traveling programs, and by doing my own research with those programs, like with James Neal's Women's Cinema from Tangier to Tehran, or Rasha Salti's groundbreaking program Mapping Subjectivity. The films that ArteEast have shown have the potential to energize students of cinema and to enrich all of us who encounter them, especially at a geographical distance from the places where the films were made. But a second thing struck me too, putting this together, the incredible fragility of some facets of Arab cinema history and the urgent need to preserve and restore and recirculate and re-engage with it. Even as US-based platforms like Netflix or Criterion belatedly catch up on the existence of Arab cinema, there are thousands of other films, Arab films, that remain beyond the field of vision of spectators. Not only that, but our guides to those films, the filmmakers themselves, often labor in obscurity or are leaving us too soon. A few weeks ago, I was hoping to add to this program a magnificent film by the Kuwaiti director Khaled As-Sadiq, Basya Bahr, or O Cruel Sea. Sadiq and I corresponded, and although it didn't work out for this program, we signed off with the hope that we could collaborate on a future one. Sadiq died just 2 days ago at the age of 76, and we've lost another critical voice in Arab cinema history. The richness of the Arab cinematic legacy and the urgency to recognize and engage with it is one of the impulses that underpin my recent book on Moumen Smihi's films and their relationship with Arab and world cinema. So this program, Radical Modernisms, Retracing Arab and North African Film Histories, begins today with a dialogue around my book. Due to the pandemic, this will actually be the first chance that Moumen and I have had to engage in a dialogue about the book since it came out last year. And we're thrilled to do that with my dear colleague Tarek Elhaik from UC Davis. In keeping with the book's argument that Smihi is best understood not in isolation as a brilliant artist, which of course he is, but rather as a participant in a wider movement of cinema and culture in the region and beyond, I've also programmed the film Dreams of the City, Ahlam al-Medina, by the great Syrian filmmaker Mohammed Malas, and a contemporary of Moumen's. I hope that putting these films in relief this week allows us to think about cinema in Morocco, Syria, and places between and beyond. And again, these films are up for a couple of days. I encourage you to see them. For the second part of the program, which begins next week, my desire was to foreground some of the incredible work being done with other archives that intersect with ArteEast's. My panelists next week include the independent curator and researcher Leah Morin, based between France and Morocco, the video artist and now curator of her family's archive, Touda Bouanani in Rabat, and the director of the Cinémathèque de Tanger, Sido Lansari. In our round table, which for any Francophone folks here will be largely in French with simultaneous translation into English, we'll talk about their work and the legacies of North African cinema and their attempts to preserve and recirculate important, rare, and groundbreaking films. What's more, you can see some of that work, as well as restorations of films by Ahmed Bouanani and Mustafa Derkawi. We're proud to be able to present the US premiere of the 1976 film Ali in Wonderland, Ali au Pays des Merveilles, by Djoura Abouda, an Algerian-French artist, and Alain Bonamy. We're lucky to have access to that film over just a 6-hour period for this premiere, Saturday next week, the 23rd, and you can read all about it in part 2 of the program. So taken together, I hope that this 2-part program gives insight into the bold and radical expressions of cinematic independence and subjectivity that have emerged in Arab and North African cinema since the 1960s. Retracing the history of cinema in the region means paying attention to experiments with form and content that, while they might at times seem removed from the cinematic landscape of today, in fact, have much to teach us about resistance, tenacity, history, beauty, and the world. I hope you enjoyed today's program and next week's program, and I pass over to my colleague now, Tarek, to set us up for the conversation today.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, ArteEast, for the kind of invitation to participate to this conversation. This is really exciting for me on many levels. It's exciting because it brings me back to my participation to the curatorial scene of the 1990s, where I was co-curating and co-directing the San Francisco Arab Film Festival, a period in which we immersed ourselves into a series of exciting films from the Maghreb and the Middle East, from different traditions: experimental cinema, essayistic cinema, what we might call mainstream cinema, historical frescoes, and then, of course, single author and film auteurs who drew our attention with a great deal of excitement. We were discovering a new kind of cinema that we had not seen before. In that very period, we were also deprived from the films of Moumen Smihi in particular. We had access at the time just to Shergi, or East Wind, which we did screen in San Francisco at the Roxy Theater, if I remember correctly. But we had not access to the other films. So I'm extremely grateful to two people for having introduced me to the films of Moumen Smihi, and I am quite excited to be talking about them today. The first is Rasha Salti, over a conversation in Beirut about other things, and Moumen's work came about in the context of a conversation about the north of Morocco, where I am from, about the complexity of the north of Morocco because of its Spanish and colonial background, but also its really difficult relationship with other parts of Morocco. And Moumen Smihi's films became, to me, really films that clarified the childhood in the north of Morocco to me. And then I came across the work of my now friend Peter and colleague, who had also introduced me in other aspects of his work that I was not familiar with. I read his book. We had long conversations about it. We even did a radio podcast on it, which is available and which you are welcome to consult. Today, my role is the role of a moderator and a deep lover of Moumen's film. I think Moumen's films are approached with love or not. And I will try to be a good moderator. This is not about my work. This is about Peter's book and about Moumen Smihi's work. And I will try to bring in some insights that I derive from both their work and their conversation. So I'm really curious to hear more about the conversation that had started and begun between Moumen and Peter a long time ago. And I had the chance in 2012 or 14, I can't remember, to host Peter and Moumen in my seminar with a few screenings and a conversation. So this is part 2 of the conversation. And now back to you, Peter.
It was at the Francis Ford Coppola Theater.
San Francisco State University, correct.
2013. Well, we will circle back to that. I think at the end of my, I'm going to give a brief presentation now about some of the ideas of the book, and just to give folks a sense of what I try to tackle in it and what I try to argue. And, you know, I hope this will give us some kind of reference points in our conversation as well. So many studies, I think, of Arab cinema focus on it, in the past at least, have often focused on it through the lens of national cinemas. There are books on discrete cinemas like Egyptian cinema or Algerian cinema, or sometimes through particular figures of filmmakers, auteurs, we might call them, after the French interest in authorship from the 1950s and 60s, or that perhaps approach things through the lens of politics. I'm trying to do something a little bit different in this book, or rather to combine several things, because I'm making the case for Smihi cinema as the creator of a Moroccan Arab modernism, something that's an active participant in a larger world cinema, and that shifts the grounds by which we understand the relationship between Arab and non-Arab cultural expressions. So most importantly, I'm arguing that Smihi's films show that this kind of experimentation in modernism is possible in a way that's not just ventriloquizing or copying European models, but rather is articulated from within Arab cinema itself, with the oral and written languages of Arabic and its vernaculars and the other languages that surround it playing a key role. And so by paying attention to critical elements of cinematic language like realism or sound or intertextuality, as well as to the grounds of some familiar cultural debates around things like religion or gender or sexuality, my book uses Smihi cinema to try to rethink how Arab cinema might be situated and might function in a wider global context. So for these reasons, I try to trace some of the histories and discourses that Smihi engages with, revealing the kind of traffic across images and ideas that his films engage. As you'll see from my slide there, my book begins with the figure of an author. In this case, Moumen essentially playing an acrobat, playing one of the members of the Oulad Sidi Ahmed Musa, one of this kind of tradition of acrobats and performers. And this scene, which is from the beginning, near the beginning of the film 44, or Tales of the Night, is set at this moment in the film in a village in the Middle Atlas during the resistance to the French in the 19-teens, around that period. And I use this image early in the book as a way of sort of thinking about the acrobatics of this author, both appearing in and seeming to control his own work, and yet also sort of escaping it and shifting our attention elsewhere. You see, he's looking off into the distance here. History is around the corner. And in a way, it's a nice metaphor, I think, for how I both try to center Smihi in the book, focus on his work, and yet also decenter him from the story that's being told, which is, of course, greater than just him. So I try to use Smihi and his work as a kind of lever to consider the relationships of Arab cinema history more generally, but also to think about it in relation to other cinemas. Now, there's kind of three inflections in this rather unusual title, Arab Modernism as World Cinema. And I want to point to those three. I think they say something about what I'm trying to do. There's the sense, first of all, of Arab modernism as world cinema, rather than, say, Arab modernism as poetry or Arab modernism in painting or so on. You see one of the images there from the remarkable Moroccan painter, Mohamed Melehi, who sadly left us about a year ago from now. I'm making the claim that cinema in the Arab world matters to discussions of Arab cultural expression. And a couple of book covers there, I think, signal some of the conversations happening around these ideas. Robin Cresswell's book on poetry and modernism in Beirut, the Sher poets, the Cairo modernist architecture that's followed by Mohammed al-Shahed in his recent book, or the book Beautiful Agitation by Annika Lenzen on painting in Syria, or the avant-garde in music in the edited collection by Kay Dickinson and Burkhalter. All of these texts, I think, are trying to think in some parallel ways about interventions with form, with history, with expression. So my sense in the title then, one of the senses, is to bring that conversation about modernism into cinema and to treat that seriously. The second one, though, is, I think, meaning that articulations of Arab modernism should be taken as active participants in world cinema, rather than marginal to discussions in film theory and cinema that have often centered on other places. So I'm thinking of some of the articulations of ideas of world cinema by people like Lucia Naguib, Dudley Andrew, and others, and really arguing that Smihi's work and Arab modernism generally should be central to those conversations also, should be thought of as part of a conversation about world cinema. And then the third and slightly more cumbersome way of positioning this title is to really think about how to define Smihi's particular intervention in cinema. I'm suggesting that this question of the relationship of Arab cinema to the world is one that preoccupies Smihi's films on the level of content and form. So in that way, I'm also saying, with the colon, the cinema of Moumen Smihi poses this problem of Arab cinema as world cinema. And through the book, I do an analysis of the films that tries to further explore those three inflections of the title and these kinds of issues. Now, lots has been said, especially in recent years, about the idea of the Nada, the Arab Renaissance. And its history has been reactivated, I think, reinvoked and traced in new ways across a range of authors. This also becomes important to what I argue in the book. And in keeping with some of these other interlocutors, I try to develop a reading of the history of the Nada that sees in it not a sort of belated phenomenon in response to Europe, something that maybe was sparked by Napoleon's invasion of Egypt, but instead a process of reading, of writing, of translation, of engagement, yes, with the West, but with other sites also. This is a reading of this period of intellectual history that's extended by some of the texts, for example, in Tarek Elhaik's volume of Nada texts, recently translated into English in this wonderful bilingual edition, the Arab Renaissance, a bilingual anthology of the Nada. And that book thinks about, and other writers think about other Nadawi writers who were in between and beside East and West, in between and beside, rather than in relationships of hierarchy. Like Rebecca Johnson's reading of Ahmed Faris Ashidyak, also a foundational Nada figure, who Johnson writes, whose engagement with, whose work was an engagement with ideas in Europe from the side of Lebanon and in Arabic. So this sense of sort of translation and global points of conjuncture is something that I really want to highlight. It's something that this recent work on the Nada, I think, does very, very well in thinking about intellectual history and modernity. And it's something that I see as important in thinking about Moumen's work. Now, it's not the moment to go through a whole lot of these chapters in detail. You can find the book if you're interested. But I want to give a little bit of a shape of it here because I think there are a couple of elements here that might help our conversation. The first 3 chapters begin with what I would really regard as more formal questions about the films to give a framework for understanding the last 2 chapters, which address more social and political questions. Of course, these are never disconnected from each other. For example, I show how the films take up histories of neo-realism to tell new stories and to use realism in modernist ways. I think about this notion of ciné-écriture, or cinema writing, that's been pursued by filmmakers like the wonderful Agnes Varda and others, but that Smihi also engages in this kind of realist modernist image making. I think about how his films explore sound in new and unusual combinations in chapter 2, and how they rely on an intertextuality that's worldly and complex, moving across film and literature and art and language in chapter 3. The films also take on the place of religions and formations of secularism in public life, and they show the multifaceted role of gender and sexuality in the Arab world and Morocco, beyond some of the stereotypes that certainly those of us outside the region might labor with. And those are in chapters 4 and 5. So these chapters take us across an argument about Arab modernism and cinema that involves rethinking the relationships of cinema, culture, and modernity in the Arab world. And Arab modernism in the spirit, I argue, of a kind of a renewed Nada. So I want to highlight very briefly 2 chapters that I think represent the heart of some of the book's engagements and that hopefully help us today in our conversation with Moumen and Tarek and alongside the films of Malas. Smihi's approach, first of all, to film sound radically revises the way that Moroccan and Arab cinema articulate the relationship of the local to the global. Sound works in these films, I argue, not just to authenticate or present what we see in the image, but it also tests out and reveals other relationships to place, relationships to Europe, relationships to the rest of the Arab region, relationships to other parts of Africa, and temporal moments, relationships to the past. And I argue that through forcing us to hear differently, and by drawing on the very complex soundscapes, especially of Tangier, Smihi's hometown, the films show how the histories of Morocco and the Arab world are inextricably tied to each other, and how they're always emplaced within an even larger set of geopolitical and cultural frames. In particular, the chapter turns to the place of radio and voice as an index of transnational flows and intertextuality. This is something that if you've seen Malas's film, Dreams of the City, you'll probably be very much tuned into as well. And it's one of the things I see as points of commonality between the films that I programmed this week. The place of radio, the place of voice, the place of sound in Malas's film, I think is very much in keeping with some of the things that Smihi is doing with his films. So I reassert, if you like, the role of sound as part of cinema as a kind of a world-making element in these films. The third chapter builds on the observations about image and sound from those first couple and tries to get to the heart of how a cinematic modernism might function in the Arab world. Moroccan and Arab cinema have often been conceived of as reactive, as beholden to other foreign traditions, as somehow belated in their emergence and their pursuance. When they disclose influences or connections with other, perhaps European places, the films are sometimes seen as derivative or as self-orientalizing. Maghrebi cinema in particular, when it has taken the form of a more experimental art cinema, has sometimes been regarded as overtly francophone, for example. But here I show that Smihi's cinema develops an intertextuality that really is a radical work of autoethnography and of cinema writing, this notion of ciné-écriture, but one that combines Arab and European and other literary, aesthetic, and cinematic texts and traditions in the service of this much more worldly and diverse intertextuality. So it's this point of multiple connectedness across the textual functions of the films, that as a constitutive part of this Arab modernism, I argue, should be seen as central, not just marginal, to some of the languages of global cinema. So with those things in mind, that I hope gives you a little bit of a taste of some of what I'm trying to do in the book. I want to close with this idea of dialogues, and I think Tarek has already invoked it at the beginning. I'm offering the ideas of the book today as a kind of a starting point, but it's because Moumen's work exists in dialogue with others, with artists, with writers, with poets, with filmmakers, who are in a sense seeking to rethink history, to remake the world in certain ways, and to do so with a kind of a critical and a self-reflexive practice of ideas. I'm evoking Malas's film today also because I think there are some, as I mentioned, shared strategies and energies between them. But I'm also thinking today about literal dialogues. I've been lucky enough to benefit for those for about 15 years now, amazingly, since I first brought Moumen to one of my film classes, an Introduction to Film Studies class at UC Santa Cruz in 2006, as he was a guest of the Arab Film Festival, which I was helping to program in that year. And that was a foundational moment for me in starting to think about a project that might try to engage with some of these films that, as Tarek said, have been so cut off from our vision in other parts of the world. And so I want to thank Moumen for his trust in allowing me to devote myself to these films in the spirit of a kind of an ongoing dialogue, which I think we'll be pursuing today, but never with a sense of ownership or control or supervision over the ideas that I might have had. This is the most generous form of thinking and dialogue, I think. And I look forward to continuing that conversation with Moumen, with Tarek, and with all of you watching, if you'll send us some questions today. So I'll pass back to Tarek and let him take us where he will. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. It was really insightful for me to hear you give us a synthesis of the book after having read it and after having discussed it with you. I should add that since I've discovered Moumen's film, thanks to your work, I've developed a habit of a ritual of sorts of viewing all of Moumen's films once a year. and I usually do like a personal retrospective at home. And I often do so to also understand a question that I hope we can return to eventually is, what is the etymological register of the term radical in radical modernism, right? And what is the afterlife of that radical modernism today, right? And I think that you correctly and inspiringly foregrounds Moumen Smihi's films and work as that of a combination of ciné-écriture, or ciné writing, and autoethnography. and the use of the term ethnography resonates with me, being trained as an anthropologist. And this combination of ciné-écriture and autoethnography at the margins of the nation is something that I think we should talk about. We should also add for the audience, and I think this is something that your book does quite well, is to indicate to us that Moumen belongs to a very, very specific category of film artists, which is a category that have him belong not only to modernism, but also he is a filmmaker and a film theorist. So the ciné-écriture is écriture in the sense of deconstruction, in the sense of the pleasure of the text, of composing a film. But it is also about writing theoretically via images, but also via manifestos, articles, reviews of the film of his peers. So I think that Moumen Smihi belongs to a category that Maya Deren belongs to, or Eisenstein belongs to, or Glauber Rocha belongs to, right? These are filmmakers who have written and reflected about their own work and about the work of their colleagues. This is not a small detail. So I want to remind you very briefly of how Khatibi and other Maghrebi theorists in the 1970s in the famous maybe it's not the term, but in the important issue of Les Temps Modernes, in which Khatibi and all describe the term radical as having a double etymology. Root, but also rupture. Rupture et racine. So that's one way of looking at it. When you put radical next to modernism, you have a kind of aesthetics, and I think we should talk about aesthetics, and an ethical mode of self-constitution that requires a moving back and forth between something that is called roots and something that requires an aesthetic rupture from a certain kind of landscape in which one is understanding as a context, but a context that is exceeded by many other forces. So if we can talk a little bit for a moment about this question of, one, what is radical in radical modernism? And two, how does Moumen inhabit this double position of an image maker and a theorist of his own images and images of others?
Tarek, thank you. I think that's a wonderful starting point and sort of takes us to the core of some of these questions. I mean, before you even went back to Khatibi and that issue, I was scribbling down to myself roots. You know, radical obviously has this literal etymological sense of roots and rootedness, and I think part of what I'm trying to signal in a way that might almost seem to be redundant is what is modernism if not radical, but I think it was sort of worth restating in the framing of this series, because I think especially in Moumen's work what we see is, as I've started to set out, this interest in working out what those roots might be in the most sort of ethically diverse and intertextually vibrant kind of way. And it's part of my argument throughout that something called modernism is not a movement that initiated in Europe, that was picked up by a filmmaker like Moumen. It's not a movement that is derivative. And the sense of, one of the senses of radicalness, of rootedness, of a concern with roots in his work, I think, is to establish that those roots are also elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And I give the example in the book of the film 44. And there's a 44 or Tales of the Night, which is about the 44 years of the so-called protectorate, the French colonization of Morocco between 1912 and 1956. There are some title cards, beautiful bilingual title cards at the beginning of the film in Arabic and in French that evoke the novels of James Joyce as a kind of a means of finding a mode of narration for this story. And it would be easy to sort of stop at that point and think, well, here's a thing that is kind of taken from a European novelist and taken up in the service of Moroccan cinema, which would be a perfectly reasonable and fascinating idea, but might suggest that the angles are only, the axes are only happening in one way. What I uncover in the analysis of the film is the extent to which the sort of digressive nature of the narrative here also depends upon an Arab cultural tradition, in this case, the work of Al-Jahid, whose sort of aleatory narratives and long treatises and books on all kinds of elements of philosophy developed this sense of digression, of narration and stories that would sort of move and twist and turn. So it's one very brief example of the kind of a both and sense of the roots of modernism and experimentation in his work, and continually sort of finding those multiple roots, I think is something that's very important in the work.
Moumen, do you want to add something to the question?
It's a little bit difficult to add anything to all what you said, both of you, and especially to add to the Peter's book. Peter, really, I think I wrote you this many times, but this is an opportunity to say it loudly, publicly. I thank you very much, not because your interest about my films, which I appreciate very much, of course, but I thank you deeply. I thank you really very much because your book, behind my films, behind my work, is allowing justice to the Arab culture. I think it is very important for today, for these days, where the Arab culture has been completely buried by wars, by ideological polemics, but about anything else than culture. I mean, all what the world today is concerned with about this era, this region, is wars, famine, religion, wars, catastrophe, daily catastrophes, etc. And I really find you like I am very often thinking about that. I find you like somebody like Charles Darwin, who began observing the British farmers and thinking about the problems of evolution and reproduction, etc. And one day he took a boat, the famous Beagle. He went very, very far from England. he went to South America, he went to Australia, etc. And there he thought about his radical evolutionist theory. And there is a link. There is a link with you because you are coming from San Francisco and you made your studies in Australia and New Zealand, and you came to the Maghreb, you came to the Arab era, and you wrote, you said, you are saying things I love very much, but I am not reading in writings of people very familiar and very near to Maghreb and to Morocco and to the Arab country and from inside the Arab countries. I mean, daily I read the American press, the Anglo-Saxon press, the French press, the Arab press, and nothing of these radical, these deep, these important questions there are in your book that Tariq mentioned right now, and that they are so much enlightening for the new generations. I mean, I see here in Europe, in France, traveling in the States or in Europe, I see all the new Arab generations. I don't want to speak about Muslim generations because I know nothing about Pakistan or Turkey or Iran. There are other civilizations, other great cultures that I love when I can read and know things about them. But I am concerned with the Arab generations. And all these new generations are talking about the religion, and never you can hear them having a knowledge of an Arab film or an Arab book or an Arab poetry, nor contemporary or classical. And this is a catastrophe because can you imagine in the States or in Europe that all the culture of Europe, from Montaigne to Roland Barthes and Jacques Lacan, disappear one morning, and all the talk is about French Catholicism, the history of French Catholicism, or history of the French Protestantism. Imagine that in the States, all the American Revolution or all the cultural, the industrial, the thinking revolution that happened in the States, one morning disappear all Hollywood. And there is no more talk than the churches and the goers of the churches and the problematics of the churches, etc. This is at the end of my life is something so striking me because I am from a religious family. Islam was very important, but there is parallel to Islam so many other things. There were life, there were sacrilege life, the life of the streets, and there were also this word, we talked about it the other day with Tarek, how to say thaqafa or hadara. There were in my childhood, in religious milieu, this important concept of thaqafa. You can be Muslim, you can be very good Muslim. Averroes went all the time to the mosque, but Averroes was thinking that a thaqafa is Greco-Latin culture, which is very important for the Arab culture. So your book is so enlightening in this direction, and it is so rich, and there are so many evocations of all these questions that I wish it could be translated in French, because French are our second country and second language, and in Spanish because it is our twin second country, and of course in Arabic it is so important, so decisive. I must stop talking because I am watching that my battery must be fitted again. And I just say thank you so much, Peter, for this work that took to you, I know, years and years and years. And there are so many to say. And about these 3 points you mentioned, both of you, yes, there are so many things to say about the famous uh, scientific epistemological rupture. This is something crucial for us to be in the epistemological rupture because there is a past, there is a future, there is this present so terribly anxious, so terribly oppressing, and the solution, the respiration, the possible breathing is exactly to be in these questions between a past. You know you have so many formula, fantastic formula. For instance, the way you talk about the global, how 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 to be how the local is global and the global is local. This is so important thing, and well, perhaps we'll have to talk about this. I just have to take care of my battery, please. But listening to you.
So what listening
Thank you.
to Moumen's response, it occurred to me that it would be very interesting to pursue the line of inquiry that Moumen just mentioned about the comparison with Darwin, the translation of Darwin in Arabic, and the way Darwin was welcomed with a great deal of controversy in the Arab world is certainly something that is worth pursuing, and I hope Moumen makes a film about Darwin at some point. I think
I mean it seriously. It's
Moumen, I am very serious too.
I'm sorry, it's my way to laugh talking. It's laugh about my ideas. But I'm taking it seriously.
I think it takes us, Moumen, to the question that you are raising. So in addition to ciné-écriture and to autoethnography, on several occasions, Peter in his book uses the word struggle when he describes
Absolutely.
the way your film were not only made and composed and then distributed with a great deal of difficulty, but struggle for me in Arabic translate as ijtihad. And it translates as ijtihad in a very particular tradition that Moumen just mentioned, which is the falsafa tradition, right? It's the Greco-Latin Arab tradition, right? And Ibn Rushd certainly is an important figure in that particular tradition. And that echoes some of the comments that Peter just advanced regarding the critique of the notion of derivative modernism, right? The derivative modernism from Europe that arrives to the Arab world. So this is a post-colonial gesture. But when there is an understanding of struggle with a lineage or a genealogy that links Ibn Khaldun and Durkheim, Ibn Khaldun, who was the object of the thesis of Taha Hussein, as Moumen shows quite well in his beautiful film about Taha Hussein. Ibn Tufail, Ibn Rushd, and then there are controversial arguments, and I think Moumen is making the argument that after Ibn Khaldun there is nothing until the Nahda, right? And those who are committed to Islamic philosophy would make the argument that there has been something between the Arab philosophical classical age and the Nahda. I do tend to side with Moumen on this particular argument, which is to say that culture and civilization are two different things. And the Thaqafa and Hadara are two different things. And they generate different forms of solidarity and different forms of discontents. And I would say that Moumen is in the Freudian tradition of civilization and its discontents. I think Moumen's films are profoundly discontent about the hegemonic presence of Islam within not only Morocco, but also in the Arab world in general, at the detriment of other theological traditions, but also at the expense of precisely a tradition that Ibn Rushd had inaugurated in his book Fasl al-Maqal, or Le Discours Décisif, or the Decisive Treatise, in which Averroès makes a distinction between the path to arrive to truth via divine revelation and the path to arrive to truth through rational practice or demonstration, right? But he says something very beautiful there. He says, first of all, these are two different paths, but there is the path of struggle or ijtihad that requires, even from the Muslim, to practice reason, right? So he keeps Islam and Thaqafa on a different register. He does not condemn Islam, but he makes the argument that there is another way of pursuing the truth by philosophical means, by rational means, and so on. So I think that when we think about a beautiful scene in Moumen Smihi's film, and I can't remember the title right now, we see the father who is witnessing a circumcision ritual that his son has to be subjugated to, like all other sons in Islamic culture or Jewish cultures. And the father leaves the house and disappears because he cannot witness the civilizational inscription on the body of his son. And of course, at the same time, he does circumcise his son. So Moumen Smihi's films are replete with this kind of scenes in which we see, first of all, an unusual, tender, loving figure of the father. I mean, really an interesting figure, the father figure in Moumen Smihi's films, gentle, believes in science and education, all the while being a faith-based practitioner. But yet there is this ijtihad, this difficulty in inheriting these multiple traditions within Arab culture and Islamic civilization, with the frictions that exist between them. So maybe we could talk a little bit about Taha Hussein, whom Peter, refers to as the hero of Moumen Smihi. Let's talk a little bit about Taha Hussein as the end point of
that's really true.
That tradition, I think.
Yeah. Tarek, thank you. And Moumen, thank you for the incredibly kind and generous words about the project. I mean, I think one thing I would say to sort of come into this part of the conversation is, in a way, to sort of invoke what Moumen was playing with, which is the sense of me sort of coming in as something of an outsider to some of the issues and features of Moumen's work, and this is absolutely true on the most literal levels. I'm clearly not from the Maghreb. I grew up in New Zealand, as Moumen said. I trained in Australia. My early work was more on histories of the British Empire, something I was, very much growing up as a part of. And in a sense, this project was a kind of a re-education for me into certainly culture and languages, and then eventually into debates, which I had not been intimately familiar with. And there's a sense, I think, in which Moumen's films, in their openness and their demands on us, as I said before, in terms of soundtrack, their demands that we listen, were enabling of that process. And what I've found, really, I think, over the course of the now over 10 years that I've really sort of spent working with this material is the sense of, I hope, a kind of a humbleness that comes with listening. Listening and trying to, again, perhaps thinking about roots, listening and trying to sort of understand the ideas that I'm being exposed to in the films as I listen, as I watch. And so part of my own sort of acrobatics in the text, I think, is to try to listen and articulate some of the ways in which certain kinds of debates are embedded in these films. That, to me, is a way of, perhaps it sounds like hedging my bets, but I would say really it's about trying to, especially from the perspective of an outsider to culture and to language, and not living in the Maghreb and not growing up in the Maghreb and not being Muslim, a sense of listening to the debates, in a sense trying to translate them for other people like myself coming from outside those traditions, and to do the thing that Moumen was talking about, which is, in a sense, to shift the conversation from the assumptions that the West might typically have about Arab cinema or about Arab culture or about Arab language. It was very important in that sense for me to do a kind of a de-orientalizing in the wake of Said, to try to break up this sort of monolithic sense of what an Arab cinema might be. Oh, it's going to be all about religion, or it's going to be all about the Palestinian conflict and Israel. It's never going to be about aesthetics or ideas or beauty or any of these kinds of things. So it was important to me to work from my sort of background to make all of those things more complex. At the same time, what I recognized the deeper I got with the films was that what I wanted to do was to try to contextualize what I was seeing and hearing as debates that I know, even as an outsider, are taking place and have taken place across centuries within Arabic-speaking cultures. And that's why, especially in that intertextuality chapter, I'm trying to draw on these threads. I'm trying to say, how do we understand this image? How do we understand, for example, the scene that you evoked, Tarek, of the kind of divided and deeply conflicted relationship of the father to culture, to religion, to patrilineage, and so on? How might we understand that? Not just those of us on the outside, but how have those debates that are being invoked, how can they be understood? How can I kind of put some of these pieces together intertextually, thinking about their various components? So that is very much what I try to do, especially in those latter chapters, which take on questions about religion. And I'm trying to sort of invoke, present, put alongside each other some of these traditions and some of these debates. And to come back to your question, Taha Hussein, for Moumen, I can see, is very, very central to some of the ways of understanding those complexities. And the questions aren't easy, and there are no sort of final answers to them, but at least I feel like my role in the book was to try to expose those and to try to put them in dialogue. And people will have their own investments in people who are more familiar than me with the issues and culture will have their own investments in that. But that's okay. The point was to sort of put the debates side by side and give a sense of what that intellectual and cultural context is. I hope I've tried to do that while listening and, in a sense, not overstepping.
So I think we can proceed with a brief conversation about Taha Hussein. I insist. And I insist because I believe that Taha Hussein, in Moumen Smihi's way of thinking, represents something of the order of an ethos. It's really a way of conducting yourself in the world. It's really a manner of engaging the world in such a way that it takes this notion of ijtihad and struggle as its foundation. But in order to precisely critique the foundations of Arab education, of Arab aesthetics, of Arab philosophy, of ways in which the secular ought to be understood, critique of the way the secular, or what we understand that the secular, is something that was present in different forms and under different names within the history of Arab thought. And I think that there is, in this conversation between Peter and Moumen, the possibility to flesh out an ethos of struggle, and an ethos of struggle that really centers around this figure of Taha Hussein. And Taha Hussein, I think, Moumen, if you can say something about him, is central to you for a couple of reasons. And one of them, which I would like to mention very briefly, and you say it in your film about Taha Hussein, is this allergy to the panegyric, to this, we Arabs are the best, we Muslims have, we are the greatest civilization, and so on, right? This idea of continuous kind of lamentation over the ruins of what has passed, right? And I would like you to say a little bit about why Taha Hussein becomes, and his portrait is an auto-portrait of sorts of a Tanjawi or a Tanjeri filmmaker that you are.
The etymology of Ismail and Israel are Ismail in Arabic and Hebrew. In Hebrew also, I suppose, because I don't know Hebrew, only from my childhood listening to my Jewish neighborhood. But the etymology is Ismail is Sama'a, and Israel is Ra'a. That means Ismail, Sama'a, the verb to listen, and Israel, Ra'a, the verb to see. And both, well, you know the biblical mythology. The one is of a beloved young woman, Ismail, but very unhappy, and the other Israel, etc. You know the etymology, but I want to insist on the concept of sama, Ismail, sama, to listen, listening, and the way you had this feeling of the importance of sama in Arab culture. The modernist made a translation for a word that exists in their language in Arabic and which is stronger than the translation. The modernist wanted to translate sama by musiqa, music, which is European. But music is another etymology, you know it, and sama, it's a fantastic etymology because it is referring to the listening, but not only physical. Sama is the music for the Arabs, and before the music, the poetry, to listen to poems, to listen to poets. And this is so fundamental that it is one of the etymological ruptures to listen, not only to see. There is this famous verse in poetry saying that the love is coming by the ear before the eye. We love because we hear about somebody or something before seeing it. When you mention, dear Peter Habermas, modernity has always been unfinished. And when you say this so important point that not only out of Europeocentrism and Americanocentrism, modernity is everywhere and in every time. Modernity began with the antiquity. Modernity began with Greeks, with Romans, with the third, I pretend, antiquity, which is the Arab antiquity. And the concept, Tarek, you mentioned, is so much an epistemological rupture also, the one of ijtihad. You'll permit me simply, please, because I know you are an expert of Ibn Rushd, you'll allow me, please, to mention his professor, who is so radical, so important, and so repressed in the worldwide culture. And his name is Ibn Tufail, who is the first one in the 10th century who talked about two fundamental concepts that are all the human knowledge, the human culture, the human thinking is directed by two concepts, the manqul and the ma'qul. The manqul is the copy, the repetition, the reference, the tradition. My father and grandfather said, I am saying the same thing. This is manqul, this is the copy, this is the irrational, this is the tradition. And he is directly mentioning that monotheism is belonging to the manqul. Monotheism is a discourse that is coming from the profound human history, and it is repeated, it is copied from one to the other. Let's think about the fantastic book of Sigmund Freud, The Man, Moses, and the Monotheism. The monotheism is a copy, the one of the other. And in front of this, Ibn Tufail in the 10th century, in the Middle Age of the world, of the Mediterranean world, in any case, where Christianism was forbidding any kind of free thinking, as well as Islam. Ibn Tufail is saying that in front of the repeating monotheism, there is another fundamental cultural concept, which is al-ma'qul. And ma'qul is coming from aql, which means rational, which means brain, which means head, etc. And this is Tariq, something so important, and in fact, the feeling, the Marcel Proust is always saying 1,000 times in his book that intelligence is nothing comparing to the sensitivity, to the sensibility, to the feeling, to feel things. And Peter, you had this fantastic feeling that all my thinking, this question of l'écriture and ethnography, is completely linked to my childhood and to this city, as Tarek also mentioned it. Because in my childhood, it was very naturally, it was very realistic, it was very comfortable also to be in the same time in the sacred life and the sacrilege one. And perhaps you mentioned something very, very important also from the book of Susan Gilson Miller, saying that there is no pure Morocco. This is so important because Morocco, and that means Maghreb, because it is really something that it is continuing till Egypt and coming from Egypt and coming from Egypt to Morocco from the beginning of the history. This life in Tangier and the fact that very, very young, I could go to the French school and also to get the book of Taha Hussein, Al-Ayyam, the days describing miserable Arab childhood, not only in Egypt, but in Arab. Till then, since coming to Paris and going to Collège de France and studying ethnography, etc., I get to Tarek this now my profound feeling that in the Arab world, always I'm speaking about the Arab world, there are these two directions. The Orient is very mystical. The Orient is always talking about istishraq. All the Orient philosophy is about istishraq. And what is absolutely original and fantastic is that in the Maghreb, in Morocco, in Andalusia, in Algeria, in Tunisia, since the beginning of the thinking, the problem is not listishraq, the problem is this opposition ma'qul and ma'qul by l'ijtihad. Ijtihad, etymology, jihad. Jihad, it's not at all killing people. Jihad means literally, etymology, effort. I think that Seth wants that I don't monopolize talking. I'm sorry.
Moumen, what you are saying is very important, and we are going to start now opening questions to the audience, and I will continue talking. And there are many comments here by friends and colleagues that I hadn't seen in a very long time, who really insist on how your work is important, and to many of us, Moumen, I should add that the Morocco we see in your films, the Tangier we see in your film, is really the Morocco many of us would like to live in, and with that voice, with that tone, with the soundscapes that Peter writes about so beautifully and insists on. Sama. So that's why I want to connect to Sama, right? And of course, selfishly, I want to hear you talk about the sounds of the sea, the sounds of Al-Huwata, the fishermen, the sounds of precisely that cosmopolitan ethos that acquires the form of navigation on the Strait of Gibraltar. You can feel that what you are saying in the Taha Hussein film, that in the Arab world, or at least in many parts of it, we don't think in terms of centuries. We think in terms of dynasties. There is the Abbasiyya, and then there is the Almohad, so Averroes and Ibn Tufayl, that's the Almohad, and then there is Andalusia, obviously that you talk about. That's Tangiers too, and Tetuan to a certain extent as well. But there is also this idea that from the sounds, the way you edit sound, and the privileging of sound, and the maritime imaginary, you can tell that this is where the richness of your intellectual milieu also comes from, and that enables you to do this genealogy. So I'm going to be talking until I find questions that I will read, but you have beautiful comments by Kati Wazana, by Bushra Khalili, and who are admirers of your work, And
Tarek, folks can put questions for us
exactly.
in
So
the chat, right?
so
And
please
we'll
put
find
questions
them.
in the chat. Yes.
Yep.
So sound. Let's talk a little bit about sound, not as a philosophical etymology, which we've done quite well. Let's talk a little bit about the sound of your films.
Well, you noticed that the musician, the sacred or the sacrilege musicians in Arab world for the Quran as well as for rap, there is this gesture to put the hand on the ear, and it's a way of making a relationship with the voice and modulating it's like the Western engine of rhythmic music or other European Western. This hand on the ear and modulating how the music is going is something important. In my films, this is central with what I learned that movie it's not image, and it is of course the history of cinema. It is of course the history of literature first, then theater, then photography, then painting and photography, etc. But the here too there is an epistemological rupture. The cinema is suddenly something that's trying to put sound and image on the same level, and that means that there are two kind of significance structures, significant structures. What you are saying in images, it's not it's not what you are saying in sounds, and uh, it must be problems of relationships, of oppositions, of different directions, etc. Living in the Medina, anyhow at the time, because it changed totally today. The Medina was a space forbidden to any kind of machine. There were only human voices, human paces, animal cries, animal paces, but all what was machine and all what was so the modern life were things coming from very, very far from, for instance, the harbor, from the western part of the city, and discovering the modernity is discovering also its sounds that are completely different. It's not a difference of images, it's a difference of sounds. The sea is central because we have this part of the world, Tangier, which is straight, and it is also kind of a repressed, refoulé, because there is a world there. There is, again, this Ms. Miller expression, no pure Morocco. The strait in itself is so important Mediterranean world because there where the history of Europe and North Africa uh, through the Berber history, the Arab history, the Jewish history, the Muslim history, the Christian history, etc., etc. And it was, there is this concept so fundamental also in your book, Peter. I am so grateful you mentioned it. The idea of the back and forth, le flux et le reflux. And I mentioned it at the beginning of the Muslim childhood. When the Muslims were in Spain, the sounds were the mosques and the sama, and there were no more Christian music or bells. But centuries after that, 5 centuries after that, it was the country in the north of Morocco, in my town, suddenly in the streets of Tangier, there was wine. There was flavor of wine. There was barrels of wine. There was ham hanging from the ceilings, and there was flamenco, and there were churches, etc. in the Muslim world. And this back and forth, flux and reflux. Again, I am from uh, a religious family. I remember that at the Tate, modern Tate in London, I said that somehow we didn't saw the colonialism as enemy. That shocked some people there. But what I meant, what I mean, is that the Muslim or the Arab culture is so sure of its territory. It is called Dar al-Islam. It is called the house of the Islam. So in your house, you can have guests because it's completely temporary. Even if they came with force, if they came conquering, etc. And also there is this idea, uh, colonialism of Europe, of the Arab world. Okay, but we Arabs, we must remember that we have been in Europe for 5 centuries, and we don't call it colonialism. Either Europeans either don't tell this moment it's the Arab presence, it's the Arab influence, etc. So the expression of the sound, it's also the expression of these relationships between what you see and also what you hear, which is a meaning. To hear is a meaning. It's not only a sound. It's very important for me that sama means in the same time something very realistic and banal, nothing, just to hearing, but it is also something very high, culturally speaking, that is music.
And for folks watching, I mean, I think there's two places in the program of films by Moumen that's still available until the end of the 17th. In his very first film out of EDEC, out of film school, Simo, the Unlucky Man, this use of sound, this kind of choreographing and composing with noise, with sound effects, in this case set in Paris, is just a remarkable way of working with sound. And in A Muslim Childhood, which is in the program as well, I think there are several places that really evoke what Tarek and Moumen are just speaking to, this literal sound montage where we have this kind of juxtaposition of sounds that are both conflicting, but are also sort of expressing this overlaying and polyphony of ideas and discourses, and especially of languages. And I want to sort of mention briefly the importance of different languages in Moumen's films. Of course, there is Fusha, there is classical Arabic, we would call it in English, which we hear at various moments. But these films are full of love for the local, very, very particular languages of the Maghreb. And I mean that in the sense of city by city. If you develop an ear for it, you will hear the ways in which the films work with the very slight variations of language from place to place. They're often dropping us in at the beginning of the film with song that is in Amazigh languages or is in Darija in different points, the importance of poetry that's spoken in vernaculars. And this is something that I really try to evoke in many places in the book, against the idea that art cinema is always about something lofty. This is also about things on the ground, the everyday, the local, the popular. This is very, very important, I think, to movie films. And I would just say, as a kind of a compliment, I guess, this is completely in keeping with Moumen's desire here to speak to us in English, to switch codes, to move back and forth between languages, and to be able to kind of continue these conversations.
There is Tarek, a kind of sound ethnography, and I had the chance of working with French sound engineer who is Gérard Delassus, who has been working with Jean Rouge. And Gérard Delassus, the sound engineer, worked a lot with Jean Rouge in Africa, in Niger especially. And there is something very important in the what we call direct film or cinéma du réel, cinéma direct, which is, there is something very important, is that the engineer, the sound engineer, can go by himself with his recorder, and he came back with une moisson. He came back with a fantastic sound harvest for me. And at the in the editing room, when editing, editors can say, well, all this, it's not direct sound, it's not dialogues, etc. It's not important. I am worshipping this harvest because in it there are these different languages. Because if you go with your recorder in a street, you pass from someone speaking Arabic to another speaking Berber, to another speaking sacred, to another speaking sacrilege. And to make a mix of it, this is exactly the other side of the film. A film is two sides. It's not only putting an illustration, sound, or music on images. This is a false film. The real artistic film is dual, is painting and music, and literature, of course,
Thank you, Moumen, for these beautiful answers. Peter, I will. I think, as far as I'm concerned, I want to hand you the floor. It's 10:30, and I don't. There are many really wonderful comments. I don't see questions. Maybe I'm not handling the chat room very well. But Moumen, I want you to know, Peter, that there are many comments that are quite, expressive of their admiration for both the book and the films. So Peter, I leave you the floor to tell us how to proceed at this point.
Tarek, thank you. Well, I think we should wrap up, but I want to thank everyone for their participation, to urge you, if you haven't already seen the two films by Moumen, Simo, The Unlucky Man, and A Muslim Childhood, Al-Al, or Le Gosse de Tanger, along with Mohamed Malas's film, Dreams of the City. Those are all still available on the Eventive platform through the 17th. And also, if you're interested in the kind of ideas that we've been thinking about today, and you want to pursue this sense of thinking about Arab and North African film histories, we'll be back again next week, or I'll be back again next week with Leah Morin, Tuda Bournani, Sido Lansari, and a fantastic set of films next week, including a US premiere for a very, very short period of time. Those are all in the Arte Archive platform as well. I think Beth is going to post a link to that for us. And you can RSVP for that panel. If you're interested in the ideas of the book and you're curious about it, I will put in a plug and say you can buy it directly from University of California Press with a 30% discount if you use the discount code that we're going to paste into the chat. And if you're curious about that, you can pick it up with a discount there. Thank you, Moumen, for being, as always, just such a wonderful interlocutor and being in dialogue with us. Yes?
Just a last word. It's about Tahsin. There is so much to say, but there is just a word to say, is his book, Al-Fitna Al-Kubra. It's about what's happening today, this terrible war about Shiite and Sunnite. That means 14 centuries of this war that Tahsin described in his book. And it is scandalous that this book is not translated, neither in French nor in English, and it is not in pocket books for people who are reading to understand what's happening. Thank you very much for all of you.
Moumen, thank you. And thank you, Tarek, for a wonderful job moderating. Robbie, one of my students, I see your question in the chat. We have to close, but perhaps Moumen and I will construct an answer for you for next week. So I think it just remains to thank everyone once again for coming, to thank you to ArteEast for allowing us all to do this event. And we'll look forward to seeing you again at part 2 of the program beginning next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Goodbye.
Goodbye.